Hi, people. Notes 1.5 are on applications of systems of equations. This is the first day of 3 days because there's a lot of different types of questions you might see with these systems of equations. And this part right here, we're going to do together as a class. So you'll go through that with your teacher. And so we're going to pick up this video with the steps of modeling. And these steps are going to be really important. I put like stars next to these steps because they're really important to help you be able to set up your equations and take those words and put them into mathematical symbols. So in our first example that we have here, we're going to follow these steps that we have here. And I'm going to model for you what I would do for this first question by following these 5 steps that we have here. So the first step says to identify the unknowns and give them a variable. So that means we're just going to write our let statement. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually read the question. It says the sum of two numbers is 72. So that's important. Sum is 72. It's really important that we know that they add up to 72. Their difference is 48. And then it's asking us, what are the two numbers? So we're trying to figure out what the two numbers are going to be. I'm going to highlight this in a different color so I know that's what I want to find out. So the first steps is to identify the unknowns and give them a variable or write a let statement. So the things I don't know in this problem are what the two numbers are. So right here, what I'm going to say is let the first number, if I don't know something in math, I'll call it equal x. And then we're going to let the second number equal y. So we're done with step 1. We've identified our unknowns and we've given them variables. Step 2 says to use the number of variables, so however many variables that we have here, to determine the number of equations, and then we want to write them. So here, because we have 2 variables, that means that we have to write 2 equations as well. So what are those 2 equations going to be? Well, the first piece of information that's given to me is that the sum of the 2 numbers is 72. So that's equation number 1. I know that if I add, sum means to add. If I add the 2 numbers together, I'll get 72. Okay, and the second equation that's given to me is that their difference is 48. So, and remember, difference means to subtract. So right here, my second equation says that if I subtract the 2 numbers, I will get 48. That's the hardest part, writing the equations. This one's not so bad. We're going to get into ones that are a little bit more challenging. So step 2 is done. Now, step 3 says to solve the equations using the method of your choice. So here I've got 3 choices. I can use substitution, elimination, or graphing. I don't want to graph because I don't have a graph here and I don't want to just deal with graphs. So I'm going to try to do substitution or elimination. For this, both are quite easy. I'm actually going to do elimination because I can see that I have a positive y here and a negative y. So when I add those together, they'll cancel out. So I'm going to add these together. I'm going to use elimination. And when I add the x and the x together, I get 2x. 1x plus 1x is 2x. 1y minus y cancels out, gives me nothing. And then I can add 72 and 48 together, and that gives me 120. Divide both sides by 2, and I get x equals 60. Now that I know what x is, I also have to solve for y. So here I'm going to use the first equation. It doesn't matter which equation you use. I'm going to use the first equation and I'm going to replace this x with 60. So 60 plus y equals 72. Subtract 60 from both sides and I get y equals 12. So those are my solutions here. I know that x is 60, so I know that my first number here is going to be 60, and I know that y is 12, so my second number is going to be 12. So I'm done with step 3. I solved using the method of my choice. The next thing I want to do is ask myself if my answer makes sense. So let's go through and think about what the answers are saying. It says that the sum of the 2 numbers is 72. So that means that if I add the 2 numbers together, I should get 72, which is true, right? The 2 numbers, when you add them together, you do get 72. And then it also says that the difference is 48. So if I subtract my 2 numbers, I should get 48, which is true. 60 minus 12 is 48. So this does work as well. So we are done with making sure that our answer makes sense. And then the last thing that I need to do is just write a concluding statement. So I'm going to say, therefore, the 2 numbers
are 60 and 12. And I am done with this question right here. All right, and number 2, we're going to go through and do the exact same thing that we did before. We're going to go through and make sure that we follow these steps. So step 1 says to identify the unknowns and give them a variable. So we're going to write our let statement. So let's go through and read through our information right here. So it tells us that Josh earns an hourly wage and he also gets tips. So then it says that 1 week he worked 12 hours and made a total of $268. And then the next week, he worked 8 hours and earned the same amount of tips and made a total of $212. And it's asking us to find out what his hourly wage is. So we want to find out his hourly wage. So the things I don't know in this problem are how much he gets paid per hour. And if I don't know that, I'll call that X. And I also don't know how much he gets in tips. So we'll say his total tips will equal Y. Now, because I have 2 variables, I have to write 2 equations. So if you take a look right here, this is going to be our first equation right here. So in our first equation, he works 12 hours and he's getting paid X dollars per hour. So we're going to write 12X. And he also gets a certain amount of tips for that, and we don't know how much that is. We call that Y. So we always refer back to our let statements to help us out. And that should equal a total of $268, okay? And then my second equation is going to come from the next week. And in the next week, he only worked 8 hours as opposed to 12 hours, but he got the same amount of tips and he made a total of $212, okay? So once I've done that, and I'm sorry, it says use the number of variables to determine the number of equations and write them. So we're done with step 2. Now we're going to solve using the method of our choice. Now, because we used elimination before, I'm going to use substitution this time. It doesn't matter which method you use, eventually you'll get the same answer. So for substitution, I need to isolate a variable. I'm going to isolate y in this equation because it's just easy for me to isolate y right here. So I can subtract this 8x right here. So I would get 212 minus 8x because I would just subtract 8x from both sides right here, right? So my equation here with an isolated variable is 212 minus 8x. This is going to get substituted in for y over here. So I'm going to replace this y right here with 212 minus 8x. So I'm going to copy down the 12x, and then I'm going to put in right here 212, and then I'm going to subtract 8x, and that should equal 268. So now I'm just going to solve now that I only have a single variable here. So I've got 12x and minus 8x, put them together, you get 4x. Copy down plus the 212. I can subtract the 212 from both sides. Sorry, you're going to have to squeeze some stuff in here. So I end up getting 4x equals 56. I can divide both sides by 4 and I end up getting x equals 14. So we know that x is $14. We know that he's making $14 per hour, but I still have to solve for y. And I can plug 14 into either equation. So let's go ahead and plug it into the first equation. So the first equation says 12x plus y equals 268. So I'm going to say 12 times instead of x. I'm going to replace that with 14. Then I'm going to just copy the rest down. So let's go ahead and multiply 12 by 14. And I get 168. So I get 168 plus y equals 268. Subtract the 168 from both sides, and I end up getting over here y equals 100. So here the tips would be $100, okay? But after I'm done with that, I have to ask myself if my answer makes sense. So for example, if I get an hourly wage right here of negative $500 per hour, I know that that doesn't make sense, right? If I get negative 3,000 for tips here, I know that that won't make sense. I'm just making up random numbers, but the whole point is $14 per hour is an amount of money that makes sense for an hourly wage. And then $100 for tips is also a number that makes sense for tips, okay? So now we can just write our therefore statement. So therefore, Josh earns $14 per hour and got $100 in tips. And we are done with this question, okay? All right, people. In our last question right here, it tells us that Arya, Nia, and Talia all play on the same basketball team. At the end of the season, Nia scored 80 more points than Talia. So that's one piece of information that's given to me, okay? Arya had twice as many points as Talia. Okay? And it also tells us that the three of them together scored 520 points. And it's asking us how many points did each score. So, for starters, in this question, there's actually three things that I don't know. I don't know Arya's points. So I'll call this A. I don't know Nia's points, so I'll call this N. So, because I have three variables here, that means that I'm going to need to write three equations. Okay, so three variables means three equations. All right, so the first equation is what is going to come from what we have highlighted in orange here. So let's translate this. It says Nia scored. So Nia's amount is equal to 80 more points than Talia. So I have to take Talia's points and add 80 to it. There's equation number one. In equation number two, that's going to come from what's highlighted in red here. Arya had, so that means Arya's amount is equal to twice as many as Talia. So I'm going to say 2t. And then the third equation is going to come from this right here. The three of them together scored 520 points. So I'm going to take Arya's, Nia's, and Talia's, and I'm going to say all together, that's 520. So now I need to decide how I want to solve this system of equations. But if you notice right here, this is kind of nice because the n is isolated and the a is also isolated. So I can actually replace all of this stuff in here. So instead of a, I can replace it with 2t, right? And instead of n, I can replace that with t plus 80. And then I'll just copy the t down. And that is my equation right here. Now I only have one variable. So now I can just go ahead and solve this equation right here. So 2t plus t is 4t, right? 2 plus 1 is 4. And then copy down the plus 80. Then I can subtract the 80 from both sides. And when I do that, I get 440. And then I can divide both sides by 4 and I get 110. So we know that Talia got 110 points. Now, to find how much Nia got, I know what t is. So I can actually go through and replace this t with what t is, which is 110. So here I can say that Nia's amount is 110 plus 80, which is 190. And then same thing with Arya's. To find Arya's, we know that it's 2 times t, and we know that the t here is also 110. So I'm going to do 2 times 110, and I get 220. So now we know exactly how many points each person got. We know that Arya's points is equal to 220. We know that Nia's points is equal to 190. And we know that Talia's points is equal to 110. And these answers do make sense. So now that we've done that, we can write our therefore statement and then we're good to go. So Arya scored 220 points. Nia scored 190 points. And Talia scored 110 points. And that's all I have to do for this question and this video. If you have any questions, let me know. Make sure you write them down on the side of your paper and let us know next time we see you in class. All right, have a good one. Bye.